since corrected it. This wonderful gentleman who we just had lunch with is very, very interesting. He has a very impressive resume, which I won't bother because it's all on the web. And we're delighted to have him here with us today. And Dr. Bursztjian.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill, and thank you all for coming today. I know that with the schedule change, it wasn't easy to go ahead and plan to be here, but I'm glad that you're here, just as I'm so glad to be invited here, because especially around Veterans Day, because if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be here. The story which I'm going to be talking about has some tragic moments in it, and you even see me tear up, even though I've told the story to a variety of audiences a good number of times. Each time I do, I still learn something new, and there's something new which brings tears to my eyes. So if you see me tearing up, as I tell my dentist, don't worry about it, keep on going. And by way of beginning, even though we'll be speaking about something very sad, which is about, it's not just, I'm going to be focusing on one piece of the healthcare in the Ghetto of Lodz, which is the resistance piece. Something which has not been talked about or written about, because it was not an armed resistance. The Lodz Ghetto was the most isolated of all the major ghettos, whereas in the Warsaw Ghetto you could smuggle in a gun possibly, or get some, there was nothing. The only thing that was ever smuggled into the Lodz Ghetto were a couple of radio transmitters, but that's about it. It was so isolated, and it was isolated so for a variety of reasons. So it was basically unarmed resistance, and yet it was so it never made it into the history books yet. Although I'm still working on with Anthony Geffen, who's a British History Channel producer, and trying to tell some of that story, but. Healthcare and the resistance were intimately linked in the Lodz Ghetto. And in fact, healthcare became a form of resistance in the Lodz Ghetto. And the piece I'll be focusing on is on, in a way, the dirtiest piece of the resistance. The sanitation workers, the people who worked with fecal matter, the fecalists. So I'll be focusing on because they became the heart of the resistance. But before we get into some scary and sad stuff, one of the things which kept the spirits of people up, a form of resistance, was humor. In fact, one of my favorite books are jokes during the Holocaust, jokes told by Jewish and in some cases Gypsy inmates of the ghettos as a way of keeping their spirits up. So let me begin with a joke before we get into the sadness. And the joke was, which went around, actually let me begin with two jokes which went around the Lodz Ghetto, and they were very popular jokes. One of them was about this German officer who's assigned to work with Hitler. And he hates the job, he doesn't like Hitler, he meets Goering, doesn't like him, he meets Himmler, doesn't like him. He comes home every night and complains first about Hitler, the next night he complains about Goering, the next night he complains about Himmler. Finally, his wife says to him, honey, you know, you complain about Hitler, you complain about Goering, you complain about Himmler. They can't all be bad. A second joke, which was a favorite, which I heard from my parents, was that Hitler, who you know was very superstitious, extremely superstitious guy, had a series of different astrologers. And I don't mean to put down astrologers, but this guy was really deeply into he was also very preoccupied with his own death. And when was he going to die? So he finally decides that he can't trust anyone, except he thinks that the Jews may have the answer. So he sends for the chief rabbi from the Lodz Ghetto. He brings it and says to the rabbi, okay, you know, of course I have this plan to exterminate Jews, but you know what, I'll let go. Oh, yeah, I'll let go as long as you tell me the day that I'm going to die. The rabbi looks at him and says, oh, that's easy. See, Hitler turns to his aides and says, you see, I knew the Jews would know this. You know, they know all the black arts, all the black. Okay, well, tell me the day I'm going to die. The rabbi looks at him and says, "Oh, my Führer, you're going to die on a great Jewish holiday." Oh, all right. Now I'm going to let you go. Just tell me which holiday. Oh, my Führer, any day that you die will be a great Jewish holiday. So, you know, even in the midst of all this, people found ways to go ahead and maintain their dignity, their integrity, their perspective, not to get swallowed up. But how did it all begin? Some of the sources that I'll be using are based on diaries of doctors in the ghetto. This is one of them by Richard Moskowitz, a man who survived. And these diaries tell the story of how initially, when the Germans invaded Poland in September of 1939, the first, and when they began to set up ghettos, which was by March of 1940, healthcare was something which the Nazis tried to control. And again, I went from Germans to Nazis. I should say that there were Germans who, even in the ghetto administration, were very unsympathetic to the Nazi goals per se. In fact, one of the stories I heard as a child is about my grandfather, who did die in the ghetto, my mother's father, being told by a German soldier, an officer who was about to be shipped to the Eastern Front, look, neither of us is going to survive this war. The difference is I'm going to die feeling ashamed, and you have nothing to be ashamed of. So there was, you know, it wasn't a monolith, but at the same time, a good number of people went along with the Nazi program. There was no way to avoid it or to escape it. And the program, especially for a ghetto like the Lodz ghetto, was always to divide and conquer. So even within the ghetto, you see this is a bridge. This bridge is between two parts of the ghetto, which was, and the reason why they had that was to allow Gentiles to pass through the ghetto without being in contact with the Jews. But the whole idea was isolation. Isolation was absolutely key to the Nazi program for Lodz. And initially, Lodz was going to be seen as a slave labor camp, and eventually it became a transit point where people would be from different parts of Europe would get sent to Lodz, would stay there for a few months, and then be shipped to one of the extermination camps. When part of what allowed the Nazis to be so comfortable in Lodz was that Lodz was about 1/3 ethnic German to begin with, even before the war. So there was a large German population, many of whom were early joiners of the Nazi party. It wasn't like in some places in Germany, like Hanover, where there was a great deal of resistance to the Nazi party program. These were ethnic Germans in Poland who saw Hitler as a great savior of ethnic Germans. By the way, if you want to know, we just finished an election cycle, if you want to know which Germans voted for Hitler, one of the best predictors of that is if you look at Black deaths in the 14th and 15th century. Those places in Germany which had the greatest number of deaths from the plague, from the Black Death, were the ones which were the greatest Hitler supported. This 5 centuries later. Now, is that a pure coincidence? It could be, or it could be basically that when people deal with grief, they reach for something. They try to reach for certainty. They try to reach for something which gives them a sense of being mightier than the losses which they were suffering, and that gets transmitted. You know, look, the reason why my child died from Black Death is because of the Jews. You know, and that's how it gets transmitted, and that's how it gets perpetuated. So never underestimate, I think, that the power which loss, especially loss which is ungrieved, has over the centuries, how it gets transmitted. If you can find a scapegoat, then you go ahead and you know, there's no loss. You blame the scapegoat for it. To begin with, and the first phase of the Lodz Ghetto program was between September 18th to December 31st of 1939. There were a variety of laws which the German administration passed, which basically prohibited religious services, froze bank accounts, made Jews wear yellow stars. Restriction of communication. Again, you can't underestimate how important it was to isolate these the people in the ghetto. Restriction communication, and of course prohibition on travel and the use of public transportation. I should say during that time period, my father, who came from a very prominent family in Lodz, was one of the people who was taken as a hostage by the Germans to a prison, where eventually the hostages were marked for to be shot. What happened with my father was, and again, this can tell you something about the fact that this wasn't a monolithic operation. The night before he was slated to be taken outside and shot, this is still in that September to December period, one of the German guards that he had made friends with told him, they're coming to take you tonight outside to be shot. Thanks. So, you know, when they come, just don't let them wake you up. Just lie there. Whatever you do, don't go out. My father, they came, you know, he wouldn't get up. They kicked him a few times. They left him alone. The next day he was released. You know why? Because he was officially dead. The guards were not going to go ahead and make a fuss about the fact they hadn't quite done their job. So they let him go. At that point, again, my father, for a variety of reasons, was under no illusions as to what the German program would be, and he had the choice of either going to Russia, which many of the Jews who were fleeing the Germans had done, onto the Russian zone, or to go back to the Lodz Ghetto. He decided to go back to Lodz. And the reason he did it was because his family always was extremely philanthropic. They felt they had some responsibility. As my father said to me, they were lumber people. And what would happen was that whenever any kid became bar mitzvah, reached 13, the kid would get lumber out as a bar mitzvah present, quite a big bar mitzvah present, you know. So as my father said to me, you know, when I was 16, I had 28 people, and you know what? I could trust every one of them. I mean, there was generations and generations of trust, and he felt an obligation to go back to the Lodz. So he went back to the Lodz, and sure enough, soon what he found in Lodz was, again, the German emphasis on making the Jews be the carriers of disease. Jews are to blame for disease. You know, this is the way in which you make someone into a scapegoat, right? You say these are, so Jews bring lice and spread typhus. This was a German propaganda. These kinds of posters began to appear even before the ghetto. The idea was to go ahead and to let the Polish population and the German population know the reason we're creating this ghetto is to protect you from people who bring the Black Death. So, I mean, it may sound really strange, but when you put these two facts together, right? I mean, this became a major propaganda tool for justifying why it was that the Nazis could go ahead and create these ghettos for Jews. It was for health reasons. And you can see Heinrich Himmler, who was one of the architects of the program to exterminate the Jews, basically be straightforward. The time has come to gather all the rabble together in ghettos and then introduce some epidemics and let them all die. So this is a classic example of projection. You're blaming the Jews for what you're planning to do to the Jews, right? You're planning to go ahead and introduce an epidemic to make all the Jews die, so you're saying, well, the Jews are causing the epidemic. Just classic stuff. You know, blaming the victim, right? Projection. As the Germans were planning to create a ghetto, they also wanted to create a healthcare system. Now, why would you want to create a healthcare system for the ghetto if you wanted to introduce an epidemic so that all the Jews would die in the ghetto? I mean, those two seem contradictory or conflictual. The reason's very simple. The Germans knew that epidemics can spread. What they wanted was an epidemic, but they wanted it contained in the ghetto, so they themselves wouldn't catch it. And they were definitely afraid of the very same thing that they were planning to do to the Jews. I mean, you see these paradoxes which occur. But they also put certain conditions on healthcare. They said the Jews cannot treat non-Jews. Again, they wanted to make sure that there was isolation here. Medical, if someone had a medical pass, you couldn't go outside the ghetto. They also appointed a Jewish businessman who, as my father told me, his family would never do business with because he was kind of shady. And they just said, you don't do business with these guys. But his name was Mordechai Chaim Romkowski. And he, although he was somewhat philanthropic, he also in the Jewish community, there were whisperings about him that he was a child molester potentially, and you really had to watch out for this guy, that he may have been a pedophile. So there was even, but of course the Germans, who else would, you know, they went apparent to a number of, the first choice to be the head of the Jewish ghetto, the Jewish head of the Jewish ghetto, was a physician who simply refused to do that, and he was shot. So they finally went to a businessman who was willing to cooperate with him, and that was Chaim Romkowski, who's a very controversial character in the history of the Lodz ghetto. What they also did was they had him name, as soon as he was appointed, they had him name 12 counselors to be his deputies. And what the Nazis did was, a month after he named these 12 people, they shot 11 of them to let him know who was boss, basically. So it's I mean, terror and calculated terror. What the Nazi city commissioner published was basically that each member of the Jewish race is obligated to follow directions of the eldest, Romkowski, that's this fellow. So he became their puppet, basically, very, very rapidly. He rationalized it, saying that he was actually trying to go ahead and save Jews from fates which they were suffering in other places where they were simply shot. And there was some truth to that. But the reality is that he was their puppet in making this be into a slave labor force, which eventually would be exterminated. And even though he denied it, everyone else, there was a great deal of knowledge about this in the ghetto from the beginning. They also had him create a Jewish police force. And in terms of the Jewish police force, when my father returned from the prison, and when the ghetto was formed, he was asked to join the Jewish police force, a great honor. He was asked to do so by Romkowski himself, because Romkowski was seeking legitimacy. My father refused to do so, and this was done in front of other people. Romkowski became enraged and slapped him. My father had been an amateur boxer who had won undefeated 28 straight bouts. So he, as he said, he really felt like he wanted to go ahead and just hit the guy back. And, you know, you get slapped, but then he said, you know, the only thing that would have happened was I would have been killed, and that wouldn't do any, that wouldn't do me any good. So instead, when Romkowski said, if you don't want to be a policeman, then I'm going to make you into a fecalist, fecal medal, someone who, my father accepted that as a punishment. And fecalists were supposed to only have 6 months to live because there was no sanitation. You were handling fecal matter. But what very quickly happened as time went on, and I'll get into this in some detail, the fecalists became the heart of the resistance. The reason being that the German administration became very dependent on the idea that if there was not good sanitation in the ghetto, then the epidemic within the ghetto may spread outside the ghetto. And what happened at one point was that one of the fecalists, as they were hauling these tanks filled with fecal matter, one of them was shot by a German guard. what happened was all the fecalists said, we're not working, that's it. And an order came out from the German High Commissioner, Bibo, saying, okay, don't shoot these people. So what was supposed to be basically a death job became ultimately the route to the resistance. The other part of it was that since these people, the order came out, don't shoot them, they began to have greater freedom of movement than a variety of other people. Plus, they stank, which meant that the German patrols, and I'm going to go into this a little bit, would keep away from them. You don't want to get next to these really smelly, stinky people, which again gave them a good deal of freedom of movement. So instead of being a policeman, he became a fecalist. Here you see Hans Bieber, who is the German High Commissioner of the city of Lodz, well known for both his cruelty, sadism. He would rape Jewish women and then kill them, basically. An incredibly awful human being. The one piece of good news is that after the war, he just continued to live. He went back to Brennen, which is where he came from, thought that he had done nothing wrong, lived with impunity, was caught, brought back to Poland for trial, and hung. And I actually got to meet one of the people who was a medical student who did an autopsy on his body. So that's his small contribution to human welfare. Even though Rumkowski liked to elevate himself, he was meeting with Himmler, he was very much the he was very much the puppet of the German administration and Bieber. The way the healthcare system was used was to go ahead and to have doctors perform medical exams for slave labor outside of the Lodz ghetto, and also to separate the healthy from the sick, because the Germans demanded that a certain proportion of people, maybe like 10,000 a month, be delivered to them, either for slave labor or for extermination. So doctors were very often put into incredibly difficult positions. If you don't do it, then they'll just go ahead and kill everyone. If you do it, that means that you're marking certain people for death, basically. I mean, horrible. I mean, just imagine yourself being a physician having to make that kind of decision. And physicians try to, resist to some as much as they could. In fact, one of them, who my parents knew, Victor Weisskopf, became one of the leaders of the resistance, because this was obviously against any sense of medical ethics that you could live with. Here's, in terms of, again, the big picture, here's an account of a woman doctor at a woman's labor camp. The sick lay in bunks of 3 layers, operations with no anesthesia. The percentage of sick people could not exceed 5%. If it exceeded 5% at any time, then these people would be removed to be exterminated. So if you caught someone sick, you might be marking them for extermination. And doctors who had a larger percentage were considered saboteurs and sent to the east. So if you were, as a doctor, taking care of more than 5% of sick people, you yourself would be shot. The Lodz ghetto was finally firmly established between February and May of 1940. It had initially a population of 160,000. In the course of the war, there were about 260,000, another 100,000 were people who passed through there. By the end, at the very end, there were only 800 people left. So you can imagine the terror, and how effective the terror was. And yet, having said that, of the 800 people who were left, a good number of them survived because they were in the resistance and they were able to go ahead and go underground when the final liquidation came at the very end. And of the people who were sent away, there was a percentage which survived because the Germans were not able to liquidate the ghetto until August of 1944. And also because... Yes. All the signs were in German. They wouldn't use Yiddish. They wouldn't use Polish. German. See, Lodz, unlike other cities, was going to be annexed to Germany. It was going to become part of Greater Germany. Warsaw was going to be part of the occupied territory forever. But Lodz was going to be, Lindenstadt was the name of it. They named it after General Linden from World War I. And there were so many Germans in Lodz to begin with that this was going to become part of Germany. So there was German currency. I mentioned to Bill over lunch that I actually have some of the German currency that was printed for the city of Lodz to be used as special German currency for this city. So
Polish people speak German?
no, the Polish people were going to go next. First you get rid of the Jews, see, it was divide and conquer. And then you get rid of the Poles, and then you make it, and there were plans. They had architectural to make it be an old German city. And they were just doing it step by step, basically. And it was very much divide and conquer. The way they forced Jews into the ghetto were by basically staging events such as Black Thursday, which was March 6th to 7th of 1940. At that time, they went ahead and they summarily shot 300 Jews and said anyone who's not in the ghetto by the end of the day is going to be shot as well. So you staged terror tactics. They proceeded to collect a variety of different valuables from Jews. For the German administration, including Bibo, this was a business proposition first and foremost. I mean, basically, the idea was to exploit the Jewish population as much as you could, steal as much as you could, get as much as you can from slave labor, and then exterminate them. But the reason why they were not exterminated right away, unlike what happened in Russia, for example, is because here they made this into a business of death, basically. And they were critical of the German soldiers in Russia who would just shoot Jews because you didn't get the slave labor, you didn't get the Jewish property necessarily, and the idea was to extract as much as possible before you exterminate. So it's extract before you exterminate. And the message he gave to Rumkowski was, look, the way we will make sure that here you'll be able to live and work, unlike in Russia where we are. And the way to do it is you have to go ahead and do work which is valuable to the Third Reich. So they established factories. And over 117 slave factories were established in the ghetto, and they ranged anything from ammunition to making of uniforms. I should say, and even there, as they were doing that, there was one form which resistance took was sabotage. Now, how can you sabotage a uniform when you're making it? What would you guess? How would you sabotage a uniform if you're sending it to the... You don't sell it. Right, you don't sew it. You don't sew it. Yeah, well, one of the forms of sabotage was to go ahead and sew the buttons with a couple of threads missing. So the idea was when these buttons on these heavier coats went to the east, the buttons would fall off. So this became a popular form of sabotage. When it came to machinery, you would put a little sugar in the tank, basically. There was another form. So eventually, not so much that you get into trouble, but so that eventually it catches up. So, yeah.
So this opened the door for people like Schindler.
This opened it, yeah, Schindler in Krakow basically had a slave factory, except he loved his slaves, yeah, which was the paradox of the man. But that's right, that was the difference. On the other hand, people like Bibo, I forget who Schindler's Nazi counterpart was, but he extremely hateful. I mean, in fact, the only thing which kept someone like Bibo from proceeding with extermination was he was told it was bad business. So. But extermination, even though they did not get into an active program of extermination except for several periods of time, extermination by hunger, and hunger as a weapon, was a major part. And again, in terms of healthcare issues, starvation played a major role. My mother's father died of starvation eventually because he insisted that my mother get his rations, because he said, "You're young, you'll survive. I'm old, there's no way I'm going to survive." So he would insist that my mother get his rations. There were hospitals created, and again, there was enough of a sense of community that food was people would literally part with their rations to keep the hospital cafeteria going. So even in the midst of trying to divide people and trying to go ahead and set people against each other, there was still acts of goodness and kindness which occurred in the community. But it was a fight for survival. And here what's happening is people are struggling with each other to try to get some wood. The winter of 1941 is a particularly cold winter. And when this house collapsed, people tried to get wood. And you can see people struggling with each other. So there was both support, but there was also conflict which existed. And the Germans made sure that if there was any resistance, they would go ahead and stage public hangings and leave people hanging, leave the bodies on display for as long as possible to seek to intimidate people. In this kind of setting, as you can tell, some people became demoralized, and a variety of people began to commit suicide. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Jacob the Liar. You've seen it. Yeah, it's about a man who says he is a radio transmitter, and then he doesn't, but he gives people some good news, and then the doctor says, "You have to keep up the news because otherwise there's too many suicides." It was based on the Lodz Ghetto experience, actually. Very often, a mother and a son would die together. March 24, Josephina Beck, widow, and son Egan, death by poisoning. They wanted, this was, again, their own act of resistance. They wanted to say, if I'm going to die, you can't kill me. I would rather take my own life. My own father's feeling about it was, if I'm going to die, better it should be because they at least had to waste a bullet on me than to go ahead and kill myself. Yeah, Bill?
Sir, as a psychiatrist,
Yes.
is that rational behavior?
Yeah,
What
gosh.
does that mean?
Yeah, well, see, gosh, you're asking a great question, though. You know, the usual categories of what's rational and what's irrational get stretched in these extreme situations. The fact that someone feels so helpless that they don't see any solution to their suffering except by taking their life themselves as an act of defiance makes it much more of a political act, in a sense, than a irrational act. Now, you can disagree about the politics of it, and I would. I think it's a counterproductive political act, but it's the usual kinds of categories of psychosis versus reality-based suicides. Just they begin to break down, and you said rationality, whatever that means. Well, this in a way raises that question, right? What does rationality mean under these circumstances? I mean, that's one of the reasons why I've been working with the Brandeis Center for the Study of Families and Children during the Shoah, which Joanna Michlik, by the way, runs. For those of you who are interested, she has tremendous info. To begin to, I think we can learn from these kinds of extreme situations. And certainly, the question becomes applicable then as to if someone who has an illness wants to commit suicide, is it a rational act or isn't it? Well, it very much depends. Why would say is the following: that question can only be asked after you provide the person with every possible degree of support and relief from suffering. If you're not providing someone with support and relief from suffering, you can't even get to that question to begin with, right? But it's vital. Yes, please.
That's an unusual number of suicides for that population.
For that
Often our GIs, a
Yes, it was certainly way higher, I mean, by orders of magnitude than from before the war, yeah. So in that sense, it was unusual. Is it unusual for people in these kinds of extreme situations? No. In fact, if anything, it may have been actually lower than some of the other ghettos because of the fact that there was an active resistance which tried to keep people alive. And even if it meant spreading lies about allies, the Allies, by the way, they're planning to land next month in France. Well, 1942, it wasn't going to be next month.
Nobody up there shot themselves. People didn't have guns.
People did not have guns there, which again, that's part of the isolation. That's part of what made it such a difficult place to be, to engage in resistance. There was no access to weapons. Unlike the Warsaw Ghetto, where there was, it was negligible, but still, there was some. No way to get any guns or ammunition there. No. It was hermetically sealed. And even though, as in any history, there was always some differences of opinion, everyone who's written about the Lodz Ghetto agrees it was the most isolated. The Germans were most successful in isolating the Lodz Ghetto of any major ghetto in Europe. Yes, 1 and 2. Yeah. There was a variety of references which I can go ahead and send to you, and I've also worked with the history department in the University of Lodz, as well as with the Brandeis Center for the Study of Families and Children in the Holocaust, who happens to be run by a daughter of someone who survived the Lodz Ghetto. Yeah.
To what extent are the numbers for March 42
They were very, very typical. It was an ongoing. It was ongoing. The only time that it went down a little bit were during the summer months, when people had at least some sense of hope because of the sunshine. But fall, winter, spring, very much so. Yeah. And you can see that this was a typical scene: someone dying of starvation. Right on the street. The photographers, by the way, were Jewish photographers who were commissioned by the administration to make really nice photos, but as their acts of resistance, one of them was Melon Grossbaum, they would also secretly take other photos, which were not flattering, but which showed reality. Reality wasn't flattering. At the same time, Lodz had been the second largest city in Poland. It had had its own medical school. So there were a large number of healthcare personnel in Lodz. These included doctors, pharmacists, nurses, dentists, dental technicians, and finally the Fäkalisten, the poop removers, like my father, who were considered part of the healthcare administration. And these people, unlike the usual kinds of pre-war divides, actually were able to work together, and they were the heart of the resistance. This was what the resistance. If you look at who was in the resistance, they were from these people basically. The doctors themselves were very tightly controlled. At the same time, they were very ingenious. They would go ahead and salvage parts from X-ray machines which were in the junkyard from before the war to build X-ray machines. So the ghetto had its own X-ray machines, actually. And that's how ingenious these people became. Joseph Weisskopf was a radiologist, by the way. He was, again, my parents always thought the world of him. And he was a recognized leader of the resistance. And he was also one of the people who had one of the 2 radio transmitters. So they could actually, to some extent, follow the news. It so happened that the building which my father's family owned, which my father was in, which was one of the main church squares in Poland, was right next to the building where the statistics were being kept in the Lodz Ghetto by the Jewish administration. So there was another reason why my father had a good deal of intelligence about what was actually happening on a macro level. At one point, when um, it became impossible to take care of the sick. In December of 1940, the healthcare workers went on strike. And of course, the response was to arrest a good number of strikers and their family members. But the strike held, and again, the German administration was so worried that the epidemics which were going on within the ghetto would spread outside the ghetto, that they actually let these people go and acceded to the demands of giving them a little more food rations for the ill. So again, the people who had any power were the healthcare workers and the fecalists. These were the only these were the only people, in a sense, who the German administration was afraid of, because of their fear of epidemics and the idea that the epidemics could engulf them and the whole German population, surrounding German population of the city.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Healthcare workers had priority.
They did, and the healthcare worker and the sanitation worker, that's right. What would happen, by the way, was that the people who were leaders of the healthcare workers had a tremendous amount of integrity. One of the first ones, Dr. Leon Schicker, resigned because he felt that he could not, in good conscience, take care of people. He was replaced by another doctor who also resigned. So the Germans got the message that even if you shoot these healthcare directors, people would not go beyond a certain point. So that's where the leverage lay, basically. That's Dr. Victor Miller, that's who replaced him, who was also eventually killed. This is one of the midwives who actually survived, who I had a chance to meet her daughter. She and her twin sister, she was a midwife. Her twin sister was a head nurse in one of the hospitals. When the Germans came, her twin sister went with her family to Russia, where she stayed, but her twin sister and she switched identities, so she could become the head nurse in the hospital, because they had a feeling that being the head nurse in the hospital meant that you might have a little more leeway than simply being a midwife in the ghetto. So they literally, identical twins, changed identities overnight. Yes?
John, in these early days of the ghettos and the suffering and killing, did the people there realize, well, we know now after the war that it was a mass extermination, but at that time, did they have any feeling that they're on the road to complete oblivion?
So the question is, was there any feeling in the general population that there was an extermination program in place? And there was some people, such as my father, were very clear about it. Other people tried to find whatever hope they could. So if you have a sense that there is an extermination program, but you feel helpless, you're going to say, no, it can't be so. And one reason why it can't be so was many of the people in the Lodz ghetto remembered the stories from World War I. In World War I, the German army came to occupy Lodz, and they behaved like gentlemen, basically. They were civilized. So they figured, well, look, since they were so civilized in World War I mean, how can they be so uncivilized right now? I mean, so that was one of the reasons why even when the knowledge, when there was evidence there, people engaged in denial. Plus, people couldn't imagine it. As Sigmund Freud said, human beings are capable of both far better and far worse than we can imagine. Well, this is a little bit beyond what we can imagine. It pushes the edges of imagination. Yes.
Who was in charge of the ghetto? Was it the army or was it the SS?
It was the Gestapo. The Gestapo and Rumkowski, yeah. So it was run by, it was by, see, there were different units. It was the SS, the Gestapo, and the army. This was the Gestapo-run operation, basically. Yeah. Well, basically, Heinrich Himmler's had both SS and Gestapo, but it was and Gestapo were there to basically extract as much as possible before extermination. That was the sort of.
When did news of these ghettos start leaking out to the West?
In 1942, end of 41, beginning of 42, there was very good evidence. Jan Kucharski, who some of you may have heard of, actually was a Polish nobleman who smuggled himself into the Warsaw ghetto to bring news to the West. And he brought news to Roosevelt at the end of 1942. He was actually met with Roosevelt. And before he met with Roosevelt, he met with one of the Jewish members of the Supreme Court, Felix Frankfurter, to tell him about this. And Felix Frankfurter listened to what he had to say and said, "Young man, I do not believe you." And what the Polish ambassador who was there said, "But no, we've checked this out. We have proof. There's various backup to his story. What he's telling you is true." And Felix Frankfurter said, "Oh no, I understand that what you're saying is true. I just said I cannot believe you." And that's the problem. That's the problem of it's so unbelievable in a way. And I think that was also the problem for Roosevelt. The other, again, I knew Henry Morgenthau's son for many, many years. Franklin Roosevelt was terrified that this would become a Jewish war somehow. That this would go ahead and give food to people like Father Coughlin, who would say, "You see, the only reason we're doing this is to go ahead and liberate the Jews." So the question was how to make it public and what stage to do it. And a variety of trade. But by 1942, it was very clear what was going on. Certainly by the end of 42.
The picture on the screen
Yes.
raises a question in my mind. The starvation of the birth rate population.
Precisely, which is the reason why her sister knew that her twin sister would be much better off being the head nurse of a hospital taking care of sick people than being the midwife. But having said that, she actually did deliver one baby at the end, just before the ghetto was liberated, which may have survived. So that's this is her work out. In the Lodz ghetto, the Lodz, by the way, sits in a plain which, when it rains, becomes a swamp. That's why a lodge in Polish means a boat. So even though it's in the middle of the country, far away from any ocean, it's in the middle of a swamp in the country. When I visited there a year and a half ago, and I was in the middle of a bit of a cloudburst. And it's amazing how quick. And at that point, there were no sewers in the part that the Germans had isolated as being the ghetto. The only thing that was there at the edge of the ghetto was an old underground river, the Brücke, which became kind of a sewer or kind of a. But that was the only, and that itself would flood when there were flash floods. And I'll get to that before we finish today. But basically, that's where my father and another man gathered some people from the resistance, and that's where my parents wound up spending the last 6 months of the war, in that sewer, that it was the old underground river, which had been paved over to be a sewer. I didn't quite figure it out. I'm sure. I have a home office which is on a top floor or third floor, right, and it has a skylight. And the first few years I was there, occasionally the skylight would leak, and I hated it. Of course, we all hate leaky skylights, right? But I couldn't quite figure out why I was so anxious about it until actually I visited my parents' hiding place. They actually had every chance to be drowned in that during these flash floods. Fortunately now, the skylight doesn't leak anymore. Yeah.
Has that area been rebuilt, or much of it's kept as a memorial?
That area, including where my parents were hidden, has become a park, basically. So it's a park. It's more of a memorial now. It's not an official memorial, but it basically what the Germans did was they cleared the whole area around the ghetto for blocks and blocks. They just demolished the buildings. The book. So that's become a park at this point. That whole no man's land around the area. By the way, I couldn't quite figure out why my parents would drag me when I was a kid to this park, which was a good few miles away from where we lived on Sundays, because it wasn't a particularly great park. But when I went back there a year and a half ago, I finally figured out why they would go back to this park sometimes. Here. You can see the sanitation conditions. People trying to do their wash in puddles of water. This was, and you can see how the streets would get flooded. So even though there was often not enough water to drink, there was enough water to drown in. So here are some children. There was a tremendous attempt to try to keep the children as clean as possible. But again, it was a struggle. Here's my father, who, as I had mentioned, had been offered the job to be a Russian, to be a German, to be a Rumkowski policeman, a Polish policeman. He refused. He got condemned to be a fecalist. And as a fecalist, this is what you did. You would go ahead and push these wagons filled with poop. Your lifespan was 6 months on the average. You were supposed to die from infection. Eventually, the way my father and mother met was that my father, as I had mentioned, had a lumberyard as a kid before the war. There was an age difference between my parents. My mom was 4 years younger than my father was. So when she was 12, her father, who was a master furniture maker, took her to one hot August day to the lumberyard to pick up some wood. And my mother said to him, "We're passing all these lumberyards. Why are we walking so far?" And he said to my mother, my grandfather said, "Well, that's because the Bursztjians they're very honest. We always do business with them. You always get good wood. It's reasonable." So they got to my father's lumberyard, and so you have this 16-year-old kid running a lumberyard, right? And he sells some lumber to my grandfather. And my grandfather is going to take him his shoulder to walk back. My father says to my grandfather, "Helshioino, it's a hot day. Why don't we just go ahead and have it delivered to you? The usual charge is 1 zloty. It's not much, obviously." And my grandfather says, "Look, that's very fair, of course, but my margin is so small. That's okay. I'll carry it." My father said to my grandfather, "Look, we'll deliver it for free. Why don't you instead just hold the hand of your daughter and walk back?" So what happens is, it's now the beginning of 1943. My grandfather has died of starvation. My mother is feeling desperate. And it's a question of, again, and what to do. Well, she's not going to commit suicide, but there's rumors being spread that if you go on one of these trains, you'll be able to go to work in Germany, you'll be given good food. So my mother decides to go on one of these trains. My father, who's a fecalist, is in the train station, and all of a sudden, he spots her face sitting in the train already. And he recognizes her from many, many years before. Must have been at least at that point 10 years that had passed since he had last seen her. He recognizes her. He goes up to a German soldier who's standing guard and says, "That woman over there, she's a member of the fecalists. You can't let her go. She's essential." The fellow says to him, "Go away or I'll shoot you." My father says, "Yeah, you go ahead and do that and see how quickly you wind up on the Eastern Front. We'll both be dead." Great. I said, "Okay, go ahead, get her off my train." Yeah. So my father goes up. For whatever reason, my mother followed him. I mean, she could have said, "No, I'm not a fecalist. This guy is just lying." She trusted him. This is after 10 years of not seeing each other. He gets her off the train and she becomes a fecalist. And together, they go ahead and become part of the resistance. The resistance begins to try to build underground hiding places for people because they know eventually the ghetto is going to be liquidated. They're under no illusion that as soon as the ghetto has stopped being useful financially to the German administration, everyone, even the people who are not being deported now, will be deported. The resistance decides that on different hiding places. My father is in charge of the hiding place in this Brücke, the underground river that I had mentioned, which is also the big sewage, one big sewer. And they need to go ahead and build a bunker there. And this is how they calculate. They figure they would need to be there for at least 6 months. And they were not foolish in any way. So what do you need? You need electricity, you need water, There's an electrician who works with him. They get running electricity down there. They need cement to make sure that the water just doesn't sweep them away. But how do you get cement in the ghetto? Well, they obtain intelligence that there is some cement in a warehouse, which the Germans are using. But then they scout out the warehouse. They find out that there is bolts around the one gate that you can get into. It's bolted at night with a big heavy chain. So the question is how to get this big heavy chain undone to get in there. Where do you get a pair of bolt cutters? They get more intelligence from another fecalist that there is one of the German guardhouses has in it some bolt cutters. These were seen there. They were hanging on the wall. So now how do you get bolt cutters out of a German guardhouse? My father volunteers to go ahead and go and remove the poop that day. He's a new fellow. He brings with him it's a hot day. He's wearing a coat. Why would you wear a coat on a hot day? He puts the coat on his arm, goes to the poop, puts his coat on the wall where the bolt cutters are, hangs it over them, gets the poop, then grabs his coat, grabs the bolt cutters, and walks out. I said to him, well, weren't you afraid of being shot? He said, yeah, sure. But, I had a feeling none of them would come near me because I stank so much. So they get the bolt cutters. And then a few nights later, they plan a raid because the warehouse is in the part of the ghetto over the bridge. Remember at the beginning, we saw this little crosswalk? So they have to get over the bridge to get the cement. He and another man go out at night. They go over the bridge. They get the cement. They're huge sacks. Something like about easily 100-pound sacks of cement. Very extreme. Again, my father was a very, very strong guy, which of course made me shy away from athletics for many years. Couldn't compete with a guy. So he gets the cement. The other fellow gets the cement, and they begin to carry it across this bridge. When a German patrol underneath, hears footsteps up above, because without that cement, there's no way they creak. They rush towards the bridge and they start firing from the street below up at the bridge. A bullet hits my father in the ankle. He's got the cement. They start circling around, the patrol does, to get on the bridge to chase them. They get out, my father and the other fellow manage to get off the bridge into the main ghetto, but they're being chased in the ghetto by a patrol. My father knows that he's not going to be able to evade the so he tells his friend to go ahead with his bag of cement. My father could have dropped the bag of cement because, that might give him a chance to, get away. He says, he won't do it. He manages to find a huge trash bin. And into one bin he dumps the cement, and the other bin he jumps. He pulls both trash bins over him. The German patrol literally passed right by him. But there's blood on the bridge, and the Germans know that they've hit someone. So the next morning, everyone knows they're going to be ordering everyone to go ahead and stand for. It's like a count in prison to see who's missing, because whoever is missing clearly is one of the perpetrators, and they can go ahead and get a handle on the resistance that they haven't been able to do over the past couple of years. A Jewish doctor gets called in. They don't have any tools in the middle of the night, and they can't go to the hospital to get some tools because there'll be a dead giveaway. What they do instead is they use a coat hanger to they flame it, they sterilize it, they fish out the bullet, they bandage my father's ankle, and my father just showed up at work the next day. He was a very incredibly strong guy, so he's able to make it there. The other way in which the fecalists used their ability to work with poop, basically, to create hiding places, was they tried to create hiding places in the cesspools, in exactly those places where the Germans would keep away. At the end, after the ghetto was liquidated in August of 1944, when they go underground, Dr. Weisskopf's hiding place is found. He's to some extent betrayed, and the German dogs also find him, and he fights with Biber, but Biber shoots him actually. Before he dies, he's very heroic German. He actually says to Biber as he's dying, "Germans, you end is near." But what happens with my parents is the Germans have heard that there was Jews hiding someplace in the sewers, but every time they pass by with their dogs and their dogs start barking, they don't see anything because there's water above my parents. They've been cemented over basically, and all they see is shit. So they say, "Stupid dogs! They're barking at poop again," and they go ahead and pass by. So they use exactly what they have been condemned to survive. I mean, to be able to take something that's meant to be your punishment as your means of survival is quite a feat of magic, I would say, and the creativity really in the face of terror, and that's what they were able to do. Of course, many people were not as fortunate, but there were 14 people who survived in that particular bunker where my parents were for 6 months. They had some food. They would also go out at night to forage for food. This is more on the fecalists, and these are some photographs taken by a photographer named Mendel Grossbaum, who was eventually killed, but he wanted to go ahead and memorialize the fecalists because he felt they were the true heroes of the ghetto. So on his own, he defied the administration and took photographs of the fecalists, which he then hid, and eventually he told some of the fecalists where they would be hidden before he himself was killed, and that's why these photographs have survived. And they're remarkable photographs. At that particular point in time, by the way, you could very easily be shot for taking unauthorized photographs. Again, my mother would talk about how she would be a human horse. She would go ahead and be literally strapped to this wagon filled with poop, and they would have to pull it, but this was their job. Photographs of those. But you know what was amazing? Look at these faces. These are among the few smiles you see in the ghetto. These are people pushing poop, but they're smiling. See, this is again, that's because they're part of the resistance. Their smile is an act of resistance. You will not demoralize me. You can go ahead and kill me, but you cannot humiliate me. That was their basic motto. Yeah, sure you can kill us, but you cannot humiliate us.
Do you have any data in which all these people have the starvation and all these disease situations, the survivors, has their immunity been built up?
That's my father had. I'm glad you asked the question. Did the survivors have a special immunity? My mother died quite young of cancer. My father, on the other hand, had several infections which were supposed to kill people. He survived all of them. He had incredible immunity. I mean, in fact, when he finally died after 11 months in the Brigham ICU, the staff there, it was amazing, at his funeral, half the staff was there because they couldn't believe how he fought off infection after infection after infection, which was supposed to kill him. And he was doing this while on a respirator, while joking and flirting with the nurses. So it's quite a feat.
Was he a person of deep faith?
I hate to say yes and no, but that probably captures the truth. Deep, yes, but at the same time, with a sense of irony. That he would certainly he would take human beings seriously, but not himself. Yeah, good sense of humor also. Yeah, Bill. He was 84 when he died, and again, the reason that he died was there was someone made a very bad medication mistake, basically. But this was before he wound up in the ICU. Sad. The family history there is people lived unto their 90s very easily. Yeah, so.
By any chance, is he on tape or something?
He is, and the Spielberg, the Shoah Project sent one of their people out, Steve Spielberg, to interview him. So we do have that tape, and the USC Center for the Film History of the Shoah has him on tape also. It's in Yiddish, but a lot of it's understandable actually. Even he was pretty expressive. Yeah.
You spoke about
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm glad you asked me that, because part of his developmental history is interesting for that. His mother was an extraordinarily well-respected philanthropic woman. In fact, when I went, and she ran the family business, when I went back to Poland, the gravekeeper in the Jewish cemetery showed me that his mother's tombstone was different than all the other tombstone, because it had an outstretched hand, which meant that she was extremely philanthropic. She died 11 months after his birth. She was the eighth of 8 children, from complications of Rh incompatibility, but she was able to live out. So he was raised by a cousin who was, his father brought in a cousin who was deaf but quite nice, and to raise him. So he suffered an early loss, but when I met his nephew, who was only 4 years younger, he was the oldest, he said, you know, everyone loved your father, because your father wasn't the, and every time there was an argument in the family, everyone wanted him on their side, not because he was the biggest or the strongest amongst us, but because he was the most strategic amongst us. And they also all loved him, because apparently before she died, she made the other 7 kids promise that they would be very good to him, and she was an incredible lady. So he was apparently the most beloved. Because they said, we all felt compassion for him because he never got to know her. So he had some, so he did not, I think where he had post-traumatics, he had nightmares. He would have nightmares, but I think otherwise he was able to, and I think, well, the way the iatrogenic mistake was he went in for some rehabilitation at one of the local places, and because he had a skin infection and needed intravenous antibiotics, and when he woke up from a nightmare, some onco physician and nurse gave him a dose of antipsychotics, which made him aspirate basically. So for 11 months he struggled with aspiration. I mean, it was totally, and that's one of the problems actually with people who have some component of PTSD, even if they have full-blown, as they age. It's very easy to go ahead and not understand why someone would have nightmares. I mean, but in a way, some of these experiences continue to kill even many years later. But what was amazing about him was that for the next 11 months, as he was in the ICU, he continued to keep his spirits up, even though he had to be on a respirator. He continued to carry on discourse. And to give you a sense, when he knew that he was dying, the very last thing he said to me is, go home and get some sleep. You need some rest. So.
May I ask a personal question?
Sure, why not?
Don't answer if you don't want to.
Yeah.
In all this study that you've done, have you separated your emotional self from your scientific self? How does that work?
The question is, have I separated my scientific self from my emotional self as I've continued to study this? No, I don't think one can do so, but one can try to be objective about one's emotions, which is no easy task, mind you. And I continually, it helps to have friends and colleagues that you can be in a deep dialogue with and trust over time, to be able to take a step back sometimes and say, maybe I'm too immersed. In terms of, this is by the way Mendel Grossman, the photographer who I mentioned, who took all the photos of the fecalists. And yet this was his act of resistance, basically, to take photographs as an act of resistance, because he wanted to have this be documented. In this particular instance, he recorded that a fecalist family, or families, went up to him and said, take our photograph. We want the world to know how we lived in the ghetto of Lodz. So the fecalists themselves saw this also as allowing themselves to be photographed as an act of resistance, even though most of them knew they would not survive. In terms of causes of death, here are some of the causes of death. The one thing, notice that in terms of causes of death here, one of the things which goes way down, most of the causes of death go up. The big cause of death which goes down is dysentery, from almost 2,000 to 168. The reason is because the fecalists really did a very, very good job of maintaining sanitation. That's the only reason. Everything else, like heart disease, goes up. Why does heart disease go up? Starvation. Heart failure, basically, due to vitamin deficiencies. So there were things which people couldn't control, but what they could control, like dysentery, they did control through very, very dedicated sanitation. Here's a snapshot of someone who died, a doctor who died. Again, the other acts of resistance in the ghetto were trying to chronicle everything that happened so it could be remembered. And what my mother would say to me, her biggest sadness would come when she would say, in 50 years, no one's going to believe this ever happened. So there was a tremendous investment on the part of resistance that what happened should be remembered, that there should be something that could be learned from this. That's why never again is not just a slogan, that it's something that's deeply meant and felt. And again, that's why it warms my heart to see all of you here, so thank you again. There were attempts made to link up with the underground. Most of these attempts failed. This is the doctor I mentioned, Joseph Reichkop, who was one of the leaders of the resistance, who was murdered by the Nazis, who my friends who just loved, basically, deeply. He literally built his own X-ray machine. The way in which extermination proceeded include the murder of the mentally disabled under so-called euthanasia, which was nothing like euthanasia, but it was murder. It's plain and simple. As you can see, people did their best. There was a whole healthcare system that was set up. There were some eminent physicians, like Wilhelm Kasper, a man who was murdered, who had won Germany's highest scientific prize, who got sent to this ghetto. So there was a real concentration of medical knowledge and power here. This is one of the areas where the gypsies were, where a huge epidemic came about. There became a physician lottery as to who was going to go in to take care of these people. And the way the doctors decided who was going to be was by lottery. They felt that was the only fair way to do so, because if the feeling was there would be almost whoever would take care of these people would themselves probably catch typhus and die. The so-called wedding invitations are basically the transport lists as to who's going to be sent to be exterminated. There were numbers of deportations. Between January and September of 1942, more than 75,000 people were murdered. We talked about the medical commissions which were set up as to who is going to stay and who is going to leave. Horrible circumstances for the doctors. Jacob Lemberg was one of the heroes of the resistance. He was a doctor who was appointed as the director of one of the ghettos. He was offered a position to be the director of Lodz because he was much more respected than Rumkowski. He refused. He was murdered. So, yes.
2 slides ago, you had Western Jews were on the
yes.
kill list.
Yes.
Why Western Jews?
Because they had been transported. The Germans they did not want, for example, to have German Jews be killed in Germany, because of the fact that there were enough Germans who didn't like the idea that their neighbors were being killed. So they were first transported to the Lodz ghetto, and then they were marked for extermination. And to the extent that they could speak German, they were much more threatening to the German administration than the Eastern European Jews.
Not a lot of data. Was there a newspaper at the time?
There was, and it was tightly controlled by the administration, but there was also a word-of-mouth system which existed, which wasn't.
Does print exist yet for those papers?
There is some of that survived, yeah. Here are the hospitals, which were also, again, when the Germans decided to liquidate, they went after hospital patients, they went after children in hospitals. And here, people tried to escape from the hospital. Here's a mother trying to rescue her child. She's being kept from rescuing the child by these Jewish police. again, it's easy enough to condemn the Jewish police, but remember, many of these people became Jewish policemen because they were told, your children will not be deported if you become a Jewish policeman. So imagine the horrible choice that you have, right? You either deport other people's children or have your own children be deported. We need to stop in a few minutes, but I want to just get through this. This is the children's, the children were marked for extermination very early on. One of the saddest things that I can remember was working with my father in Lodz and having a young man rush up to him and hug him and then say to me, you know, your father saved my life, and he was so wonderful. And my father said, thank you. And when the fellow walked away, my father seemed very sad. So I was about 7. I said, well, how come you're feeling sad? He said, well, that fellow was 16 when we were able to save him. He was the youngest one. I couldn't save anyone less than 14 years. So, you know, very, very. So even in the midst of doing your best, there were things you couldn't do, things you were helpless about. This is how many people were gassed in Helmna using these carbon monoxide trucks, which were specially built to murder people. By September of 1942, there were only 77,000 people who remained in the ghetto, mainly in the factories. Here's the Jewish policeman kids were among the last ones to be deported. So he was a Jewish policeman kid playing cops and inmate. Horrible. You can see the changing roles of doctors. More and more people from resistance cells, basically, to try to resist. We're reaching almost the end. I don't want to go over time here. But there is much more to be said. The final liquidation of the ghetto occurs from June 8th to August 31, 1944. There were doctors assigned to the trains, and some doctors willingly went with the trains because they wanted to give comfort to people, basically. Others went into, like Dr. Weisskopf went into the hiding places. My parents went into the hiding places at that point in time. There were some people left as a cleanup crew. Here is my mother, by the way, with her cleanup. This is the sanitation people right here, and that's my mom right there, the person in the circle. Again, I know both my parents would be just very, very grateful for your presence here today. My mom, by the way, this is the Daniel Weisskopf, who again I hope will be remembered. He was killed by this man, Hans Bibo, that I mentioned. This is the midwife whose daughter I got to know over time. At the very end, what happens is January 19th rolls around. General Chukov, who is the hero of Stalingrad, has been given orders by Stalin to head directly for Berlin because they're racing the Americans to see who's going to get to Berlin first. Chukov, much to everyone's surprise, instead of going west, turns south, and he goes to Lodz. He turns a whole army, 500,000 people, south and goes to Lodz. Now, at that point, this was the most dangerous time for my parents because the whole German army, as it was retreating, was centered at Lodz. But no one knows why he defied Stalin's orders. It was the only time, by the way, that any Russian general defied Stalin's orders and lived to tell the tale. The reason being was he was the hero of Stalingrad, and he had a very powerful protector, General Zhukov, who had earlier gone to Stalin and when he was asked to take command at the Battle of Moscow and told Stalin that to do that, he wanted 100 Jewish officers. Stalin, who was anti-Semite, hated him for that, to the point, but he couldn't, again, since Zhukov had saved Moscow, and Zhukov had basically been the key person in the Battle of Stalingrad, he couldn't kill either of the two of them, and the two of them had worked hand in hand. So they each lived to tell the tale. Zhukov, however, after the war, was exiled to Central Asia as punishment for supporting this kind of defiance. But for whatever reason, the Russian army gets turned towards Lodz. As the Germans are retreating, they mine where my parents are hiding. So what happens is the Russian tanks roll in, and my parents hear in the bunker a voice in Russian saying in Yiddish and Russian, Jews come out, this whole area is mined. There's a big debate that goes on, which is should they leave or not, because they really are concerned that this could be a German trick to get them out. The Germans have been hunting there. Finally, my father wants to go to sea. They say, no, you're too valuable. You have to stay with us. My mother says, let me go, because all of you know that if they catch me, there is no way that I'm going to give you away. They can torture me all they want. My mother goes. It is, in fact, a Russian tank, says, Jews, Jews. She goes back. Everyone gets out. 6 hours later, the whole area just blows up. So if they had continued to spend there for if that tank had been there a few hours later, I wouldn't be here. Thank you so much for being here.